bring my band, we would play, and I would speak. And we found that it was a really successful event in that it was easy to bring people to. It was easy to get your neighbour to come, your friend, your family, who might not come to church with you, but who are happy to go check out this strange thing called jazz and have a good time. And this leads to my the topic of having realistic expectations and using the arts to connect to people. So using the arts to connect to people, with the jazz concert, what I would do with my band is we would play a set of music and we would talk about jazz in a non-threatening way, in a kind of fun way, and build rapport with our audience. And they'd get used to me playing and speaking, a little bit like what I'm doing tonight, though I don't have a band. Well, my band's on the iPad. The band is easier to take to places in the iPad. And what happened is we would work at building rapport, tell jokes, and explain how jazz works and that kind of thing. And then in the second set, we'd play a little more jazz, talk more about jazz, but segue into a discussion about how jazz relates to Jesus. So we were trying to create a seamless approach to having a fun, good experience, connecting through jazz with people, but also speaking something of Jesus into that situation and to people who wouldn't normally come to a Christian event or to church. And we found that worked really well. But it's important to set realistic expectations because the truth of the matter is, I don't think anyone through 250 evangelistic jazz concerts actually became a Christian on the night of the concert. I don't think that happened. At least I'm not aware of it. And some people would say, well, it's not a very good evangelistic technique then. If no one's become Christians, isn't that the goal? People get saved and all that kind of thing. But actually, that was not my goal. My goal was actually more like the goal of a first date. What's the goal of a first date? To get a second date. That's the goal. You get a second date. That's the goal of a first date. And so I'm thinking, here are all these people that won't come to church, that probably wouldn't come to a normal Christian event, but they'll come to this. So it's a first date. And I want to give them a good experience, a message about Jesus, a good experience, a fun time. And they see Christians and they say, they're not so bad, they're fairly normal people. And they would come to the second date. So their friend might invite them to the next event that their church has. Or they might invite them to church. And sometimes the way this would work is I'd go to a church, I'd do the jazz night on a Saturday night, and then I'd preach at the church on the Sunday. And they could easily invite people, if you want to hear more from, come along the next day and that sort of thing. So the goal is to get a second date. But I have met people who, through that, the second date, the third date, the fourth date, have become Christians. I remember playing at a church once, it was a big church in Sydney in Australia, and I played there every year for 5 years. And I met a man who was a Christian, an active member of the church, as was his whole family. And he told me that the first time he'd ever gone into any church at all was that first jazz night 5 years ago at the same church. He said his friend brought him along. He'd never been to church. And he had a good time at the jazz night, and he was interested to hear more. He went along to church the next week, and then the week after that, and after about 6 months, became a Christian. And then, after about a year, so did his whole family. And so I was really overjoyed to hear that story. But that's an illustration of how an artsy outreach event, you can have kind of low expectations for it on the one hand, and yet it can play a key part in someone's journey towards Jesus as a first date. And I think the arts have a unique power for doing just that because they connect to people. They connect to our humanity, our human condition. So that's outreach with the arts. I'm going to pause now and play a little more jazz. third thing I want to talk about tonight is this idea of outreach to the arts. And whereas previously, before Stella by Starlight, I was talking about harnessing the power of the arts for outreach, this is more about looking at artistic communities, professional artists, musicians, dancers, painters, what have you, and thinking about how can the church reach out to these people? And how can we have a witness? How can we do mission among them? And what I want to suggest to you is that artistic communities are actually subcultures. They form their own subcultures in our community. They have their own places to live. They often live in kind of artistic ghettos and neighborhoods where they like to congregate, and they share houses with each other, and they hang out with each other. So with jazz musicians, I know many jazz musicians who basically only really live at night. You know, they go to bed at around 3 a.m. and they get up at about 2 in the afternoon, and then they rehearse or practice, then they do a gig at night, and then they go out and party with their musician friends. So before very long, professional musicians only know other professional musicians. That's often the case. And if there's no Christian among them, it means unless they're related to someone who's a Christian or something like that, they often will not know anyone who is a Christian. And so not only then do they become their own subculture, this musical subculture within our community, but an unreached subculture, an unreached people group, even with their own language. Jazz musicians have their own language. I could speak a sentence or two in jazz speak, and you probably wouldn't understand most of it. We have a way of speaking, and my wife can always tell when I'm on the phone with a jazz musician because I start speaking differently. It's like a dialect. So artists live in these subcultures, and that presents a challenge for the church if you want to reach out to them, because like any subculture, you need access to the subculture. So what does the church do if you're interested in reaching out to an artistic subculture? Well, by far the most effective means is to have a missionary in that subculture. Someone who speaks the language, someone who understands the culture, someone who is one of them, i.e. an artist. And the most obvious way for churches to reach these unreached people groups is to look at their people, at their own congregation, and say, who among us are artists? Who actually have these natural connections in these relationships already? And how can we partner with them? How can we encourage them? How can we equip them to be proactively seeking to reach people in that subculture for the sake of Christ? So that's the most effective way, is to actually have and I guess I have a passport in the jazz world I don't think I live there anymore. I've moved on to a different country, I guess. But I have a passport, so I can play and I can speak the language and I understand the culture and things like that. So when I visit, I can connect with people, and this remains, my source of most non-Christian friends. Most of my friends who are not believers are musicians, because that's the natural way for me to connect with people. And so churches can make use of the people among you. But what if you don't have people like that? Can you access these subcultures? How can you penetrate them? Can you just learn? Can you pretend that you're a musician? Can you do this sort of thing? And the answer is no, not really. So again, to illustrate from the perspective of a musician communities or music communities operate through a meritocracy. And I think this is probably true with most arts communities. That is, the person with the most powers is the leader. Right? That is the person with the most respect and the most credibility. That's what it comes down to, credibility. So if you can really play, then they'll take what you think seriously. They'll listen to what you have to say. You have a hearing in that group. But if you are not a great player, then you lack credibility and you're not totally accepted by the group. So what do you do if you're not a musician, if you're not an artist, and you don't have anyone in your church, but you know that down the road there's this artistic community that just needs to hear the gospel? What do? Well, there are ways to engage. And the first thing to say is, if you're not a high caliber musician, don't pretend you're a musician. Right? So I've had friends talk to some of my jazz friends who play, and I mean no disrespect, right, through this, but they'll play a bit of guitar at church on Sundays or something like that, and they'll try to connect with my professional jazz friends on that level. But that doesn't work, because the professional musician does not consider that person who plays a bit of guitar on Sunday a musician. They consider them someone who plays a bit of guitar on Sunday. They're not a real musician. So no disrespect, no, I don't mean that offensively. I'm simply saying it's not necessarily a way to connect with people who are so seriously into it, because they operate through a meritocracy. You're actually better off being in the non-musician category altogether. Because a musician and an artist, I think, generally, can respect someone who's not an artist, but who appreciates the arts. Someone who's like a patron, or a dedicated fan, or just a friend of the arts. Musicians love those people, right? And they're accepted by musicians. So they might not be able to play at all, but because of their respect for musicians, because of their interest in them, because of their desire to understand more and those sort of things, they can become very dear people to musicians. So I guess what I'm saying is there are ways for all churches to be reaching out to artistic communities who often will not have the gospel, by carefully thinking through ways to engage with that subculture in mission mode. How do you be a missionary?